All right, hello everybody. We're going to start. We're gonna get going with our last panel. Certainly not least, and it's an appropriate panel to end with because we're going to be talking about three of Hannah Arendt's friendships. And before I start, let me just make one or two quick announcements. One is that we will announce the raffle winner at the end of the panel. There is artwork in Olin, in Olin Atrium, and also in the Campus Center Atrium. And I want to thank Amy Trumpeter, who, if you've seen some of those puppets that are out there, she's a puppeteer who lives nearby and has done some great puppetry work about Hannah Arendt. And really excited that she brought her puppets by for this occasion. So thanks to Amy. I'm sorry? And she's with Red Wing Blackbird Theater, yes. So, and her studio is wonderful. So, let me get us going. In this last panel, as I said, we're going to be talking about three particular friends of, first of all, we're going to hear from Alex Cain. Alex teaches ethics, political theory, and history of philosophy at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And so I want to thank her for flying 27 hours to be here with us today. She received her PhD from Monash University this year, and I had the pleasure of being one of her PhD readers, and it was a wonderful dissertation on Hannah Arendt and friendship, on the ethical implications of notion of friendship and Hannah Arendt's work. So she's going to talk to us about some of her work on Hannah Arendt and friendship. Then Barbara.Von Bechtolsheim is a scholar, author, and literary translator, teaches over at Yale, much closer than Australia. Will be speaking about her new book, which is a biography of a love pair, Hannah Arendt and Heinrich Blücher. And then Marion Detjen, who is here for the year as a OSIN mobility, is it OSIN mobility? OSIN scholar. She teaches normally at Bard College Berlin, so we're colleagues. She leads and works for the scholarship program for displaced students, the refugees and displaced students at Bard College Berlin. She teaches migration history and global history. But she's actually going to not be speaking about global history or migration history, except in the fact that she's going to be talking about some migrants, Hannah Arendt and her friendship with two of her friends from Germany who ended up here, Helen Wolff and Lotte Kohler. So, Alex, you're up first.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you so much, Roger, for the introduction and for having me here. It's a complete pleasure to fly so far to be at a conference like this. And I'm going to be speaking today, kind of elaborating a little bit on what Roger said in his introductory speech about a microworld, in reference to what Arendt says about Karl Jaspers and how he kind of created a microworld with his wife, Gertrude. So Hannah Arendt did ask her audience to consider friendship as a little world or a micro world or a small world. She used various language to explain this at least 3 times across her lifetime. And today I want to show how thinking about a world about friendship in this way can be productive for thinking about how friendship can nourish both our private lives and how it can be kind of it can be indirectly helpful for our public lives. So it can really help us practice on a smaller scale public discourse. I also want to show how this understanding of friendship can, depending on how you look at it, either violate or bridge the distinction that Hannah Arendt herself makes between public and private life. So, as Roger said yesterday, Arendt first discusses friendship as a little world in a lecture series that she gave in 1954. She also wrote a letter to Heidegger after her husband Heinrich died, and there she explains friendship again as a micro world. The third instance, and this is the one I really want to focus on because we can really dig a bit more deeply into this idea via this instance of her discussion of a small world, occurs in a talk that she gave in honour of her mentor, teacher, and very, very close friend, Karl Jaspers. She says, and I quote, "If two people do not succumb to the illusion that the ties binding them have made them one, they can create a world anew between them. Certainly for Jaspers, his marriage has never been merely a private thing. It has proved that two people of different origins, Jaspers' wife is Jewish, could create between them a world of their own. And from this world in miniature, he has learned, as if from a model, so he kind of modeled his idea of public discourse on his private relationship and very open communication with his wife. He learned what is essential for the whole realm of human affairs. Within this small world, he unfolded and practiced his incomparable faculty for dialogue, the splendid precision of his way of listening, the constant readiness to give a candid account of himself, the patience to linger, and I really like this turn of phrase, the patience to linger, and that's something we haven't really talked so much about at this conference, just in terms of how friends linger over topics, maybe come back to topics across their lifetime, and really spend time, make time to talk about whatever it is that they find important and whatever it is that they like to talk about. The patience to linger over a matter under discussion, and above all, the ability to lure, and again, I really like this word as well, to lure what is otherwise passed over in silence into the area of discourse. So to really lure it, to really kind of pull it into public, to make it worth talking about. Thus, in speaking and listening, he succeeds in changing, widening, sharpening, or as Jaspers himself would beautifully put it, in illuminating, end quote. Those of us who are familiar with Arendt's work, The Human Condition, will be aware that she usually used the term world in association with public life. In The Human Condition, she writes that, quote, "To live together in the world means essentially that a world of things is between those who have it in common. As a table is located between those who sit around it, the world, like every in-between, relates and separates men at the same time," end quote. So to think of friendship as a world, as a small world, is to acknowledge that friendship is a kind of public space. It is an in-between in which we appear, which we share in common, and which makes our appearance and dialogue with the other possible. In friendship, we speak and show who we are, and Arendt was very concerned with showing who we are, also in action. We put our names to our opinions. Friendship as a public space is spacious. It allows for a distance between the friends such that they can appear to one another and let themselves be seen and heard by the friend. This is why Arendt thinks, contra Montaigne, that two people should not succumb, and this was in the quote, should not succumb to the illusion that they are one. They shouldn't think that they're bound together and that there's no space and no distance there between them. They must instead maintain the world as a space between them, and it is the ability to be both related and separated at the same time that allows for disagreement in the friendship, and that's something that's come up, I think, over and over during this conference. We don't I don't know that we want to always agree with our friends. We really value that disagreement that comes with friendship. So if friendship is a little world or a small world or a micro world, then it's little, so it's limited. It's kind of a private public. Friendship, indeed, must be limited if it is to exist at all. We value friendships precisely because they're rare, because they deal with a particular person. We value a particular person as our friend. Friendship, in other words, is necessarily exclusive. Friendship's based on trust, on loyalty, and it grows up over time. And this is something that Roger said as well in his introduction yesterday, that Arendt makes it very clear that there's no such thing as a 2-week-long friendship. You really need time, again, to linger together to build a friendship. Friendship needs promise, and this might be an explicit promise, but it also might be a tacit promise. It might be sort of an unspoken agreement between the friends that you'll be there for your friend, that you'll be there with your friend rather than against your friend, even if you are actually having a disagreement or having an argument. And friendship must also hold open the possibility for forgiveness, because of course there is always the possibility that one of the friends will trespass on the other. And this is something that Arendt also thinks is very common in action in the public world, more properly speaking. In other words, Arendt's understanding of friendship has both private and public elements. Now, depending on how you look at this, you could say that this violates the very strict distinction she makes in the human condition between public and private life. However, you could also say that actually when she talks about friendship, she's offering kind of a bridge across that divide. However, she does suggest that friendship as a personal relationship does not enter, or I guess should not enter, or can be dangerous in the public realm. She says that, quote, "The directly personal relationship, where one can speak of love, exists, of course, to a certain extent in friendship. There, a person is addressed directly, independent of his relation to the world. Thus, people of the most divergent organizations can still be personal friends. But if you confuse these things, if you bring love to the negotiating table, to put it bluntly, I find that fatal to politics," end quote. And I would remind you also of the quote that is on the tote bags for the conference, "I love only my friends." Love promotes the kind of loyalty that discourages impartiality, or, maybe we can't be fully impartial, I think Arendt would think, but discourages the level of impartiality that we can at least aim towards. Friendship is, by definition, biased. While Arendt does not think that friendship in this personal way is helpful in politics, she does think that friendship can indirectly, that friendship indirectly readies the ground for politics. In friendship, we first develop our abilities for respectful dialogue. If there is something that we can learn in friendship and carry into public life, it is the practice of respectful and meaningful and careful and slow and inconclusive dialogue. There's so much more that I could say about friendship as a little world. And I think that this can be, as I said, I think this can be a very productive way for thinking through the issue of friendship. And I guess I would also note that even though we've been here for 2 quite long days of talking about friendship, it's quite possible that lots of us will walk away still wondering, like, what is friendship? I'm still not really sure. And we've seen lots of very diverse explanations or definitions of friendship across the last 2 days. But there's a quote that I want to finish on, and it suggests kind of another line of inquiry that I don't really have time to go into, but that I think is very interesting. And it's a quote from Mary McCarthy, so a little bit more Mary McCarthy today. And Mary McCarthy wrote to Arendt after having read Men in Dark Times, and Men in Dark Times is actually the book that the quote in relation to Karl Jaspers comes from. And after reading that book, Mary McCarthy wrote to Hannah that, quote, "This book is very maternal, Hannah. You have made me think a lot about the Germans and how they are different from us. It's the only work of yours that I would call German, and this may have something to do with the role friendship plays in it. Workmanly friendship, of apprentices starting out with their bundle on a pole and doing a piece of the road together. All this gave me much pleasure as well as surprise." I think it's just very interesting if we think about friendship as a world, and in Arendt's work, friendship, a world, more properly speaking, would be something that we work at to build. If we take this notion of workmanly friendship, it becomes very interesting to think about the little world of friendship that we make and create and work at. And I think friendship does have to be worked at. Thank you.
It's my greatest pleasure to be here at the end of a fantastic conference. Closer, okay. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Roger and Thomas Wild, Roger Berkowitz. You have been so extremely supportive and kind from early on when I embarked on this journey to explore the friendship, the love relationship, and the philosophical workshop between Hannah Arendt and Heinrich Blücher. We've learned a lot about friendships. I think the two of them lived all aspects of a friendship. And since we want to be in dialogue, I'll take you briefly through the more than 30 years of a love relationship and a marriage. Here you see the two of them before they met. You see Hannah Arendt she looks quite shy, big eyes, very looking out into the world, somewhat elegant. And he is a little more sloppy, sitting in a chair, thinking to himself, maybe he was reading a book, or maybe not. They grew up in very different worlds, so they bring the differences into the relationship. She was born, as you know, into a Jewish family, grew up in an intellectually, culturally very vibrant and stimulating environment, whereas he grew up in Berlin, Kreuzberg, working class, single mother. He was drafted into World War I, couldn't even finish high school properly, even though he was at a boarding school, got an emergency high school diploma. He had to serve in World War II as a kind of journalist, broadcaster. After the war, he kept working as a journalist and worked other odd jobs. But he tried to learn. In particular, he went to the university in Berlin, today's Humboldt University, and attended lectures with Hans Delbrück. So history, military history was one of his interests. Whereas Hannah, as you know, went to Heidelberg, to Marburg, to Heidelberg, got her PhD very early, was an accomplished young philosopher, had written her dissertation. She was married to Günther Stern, who was also a young, accomplished philosopher, Jewish, whereas Blücher was very involved with the Communist Party, an activist, and so you can tell they were very different. Times changed, 1933. She decides immediately to become active, do something against the Nazis. She does research for the Zionist Federation of Germany, the documentation, the papers that she collects in her apartment were discovered by the Nazis. She is arrested, after a week released, and decides immediately she has to leave the country. She and her mother go to Prague, from Prague to Geneva. Martha Arendt stays in Geneva, and Hannah Arendt goes to Paris, where her husband has already arrived earlier. Heinrich Blücher notices that since he is married to a Jewish wife, Natasha Yefroikin is a Jewish woman who is also involved with the communists. Plus, has a close friendship with Jewish artist Robert Gilbert. So he decides to go to Prague, from Prague to Paris, and this is where they meet. 1936, in the circle of Walter Benjamin, who is, as you know, also had to leave Berlin. And this is where the refugees meet, and they fall in love. Because there are not only the differences that I mentioned, they have quite a bit in common. Both of them grew up fatherless. Both of them are very interested in social matters rather than individual psychological questions. They, both of them, more or less later on encourage each other to appear in the public sphere. Both of them are refugees. They will be refugees for a second time very soon. They go through hell during the war times, internment camps, and they are both great in finding new friends and cultivating friendships. So they get married very soon after, in January of 1940. So, and here you see what love does to the two of them. They look quite different, don't you think? She looks very happy. She looks more adult, looking out into the world, quite elegant in Paris. And this is what she writes. It still seems hard to believe that I could get both true love and a sense of identity with myself. Finally, I understand what true happiness is. And he also looks pretty happy and more together, in my opinion. He's smiling a bit and looking in your eyes and wearing suit and tie. She calls him Monsieur, by the way. And after a while, he writes to her, "Endless are the possibilities of the understanding heart." And I like this quote because it defines what the glue in this relationship is. It's the heart and the mind. Understanding the world. I could elaborate, but why this understanding heart is so important, but it implies taking on responsibility. So they both are, the Germans invade France, there are internment camps, the Germans are étrangers indésirables. Both Hannah and Heinrich are in an internment camp. They don't even know about each other, but very soon, very soon, not so soon, but in May of 1941, they get out of France into Spain with the help of Marion Fry, this amazing young American who saved so many refugees' lives and families. So Hannah Arendt, soon after they arrive, sends a telegram to her ex-husband, Günther Anders, at the time, Günther Stern, and says, "Sind gerettet," saved. It sounds really euphemistic. They don't speak the language. They don't have a home. They don't have relatives where they could stay. They don't have money. They have $25 that they got in Ellis Island, she organized a little stipend, a monthly stipend, so they could pay the rent for a room or 2 rooms. They don't have a passport, they don't have a work permit. So think of that. They go through this situation together in very different ways, but they master the situation. And one of the ways in which they are able to do that is friendships. And we've talked about a lot of their friends, and Hannah Arendt is famous for hosting friends, hosting parties, in particular, famously, her New Year's party. In one of her letters, she writes, "We had 60 people, 60 guests in our apartment that was 370 Riverside Drive, so that was a larger apartment finally. And I'm quite exhausted." So she was cooking and making tea, and whenever, there's a lot of quotes in her correspondences where she describes friends coming over. So here you see upper left, Charlotte Behrath, who was a friend, but also very, very conflictual friendship. Helen and Kurt Wolff, we'll hear about Helen Wolff a little bit more. Mary McCarthy, you've already heard about her. Here at her typewriter, and she typed a lot for Hannah Arendt. She helped a lot. Here's Randall Jarrell, who was also a friend with whom Hannah Arendt worked quite a bit. Karl Jaspers in the middle, we've heard about him quite a bit. What we haven't heard, as far as I know, that Karl Jaspers became a close friend to Blücher, and what Jaspers was more theoretically exploring what the university should be is what Heinrich Blücher put into practice at the New School and here at Bard College. And I've talked to a number of former students of his and here at Bard, and they think of Heinrich Blücher as a friend, a teacher who is also a friend. So that was very touching. And here on the lower left, you see that friendship was not only talking, friendship was also recharging batteries, enjoying their lives. Both Blücher and Arendt loved to go on vacations here in upstate New York, but also to the beach. Here you see Alfred Cain with his wife Anne and Hannah. Alfred Cain has wonderful stories about how he enjoyed being with Heinrich Blücher and Hannah Arendt, and how they were so eager to be in conversation. And when they were really getting into a conversation about poetry or philosophy, they would switch into speaking German. And the rest of most of their friends could only look at them. So I will very briefly, my observation is that despite the close friendship and him being her Socrates, they were quite different in the way in which they thought. She was the analytic mind, very systematic, while he was intuitive in his. You can read the transcripts of his lectures, and they are like working by association. He was an activist. He was still a political activist in his mind. She was the political thinker. She became more and more political with the inspiration of her husband, and he learned from her. There's, in the correspondence, there's off and on, she explains to him in a friendly way that things are a little more complicated than he thinks. So she was the author. She said that teaching distracted her from writing, and yet as time went on, she gave lectures more and more and was teaching. But they had separate turfs. She came to visit at Bard off and on, but he was a professor of philosophy here, and he must have loved his teaching. And he was also teaching regularly at the New School. She was, in my opinion, very innovative, and all of her concepts are based on the experience of exile, nativity, appearance, freedom, all these terms. in the background is the new beginning, creating, reinventing herself and standing up for herself. While he was eclectic and he learned a lot from Jaspers and from the great philosophers. And I'll move on. Well, Origins of Totalitarianism finds an equivalent in the terminology, and I think it just proves that despite the differences, they often got very close. His lecture series at the New School was Sources of Creative Power with the subtitle Origins of Human Principles. And here you see the two of them in a very similar gesture. This is Hannah at the New School and Heinrich in the library of Bard College. And there they share the topics of freedom of thought, appearance in the public sphere, new beginnings, and language. Language was a big thing, but for her, speaking and writing in two languages opened more of the world to her, while he was not so good in learning a new language, and he kind of compensated in being a performance artist. At least that's what I understand from what his former students told me, how he would conduct a class. And here is, we've mentioned, that has been mentioned before, that both of them are buried here at Bard College. And you see on the left is his gravestone. He was an atheist, and yet he is buried in the Jewish tradition. And she erected this bench next to the grave, and I hear that she would sit there off and on to continue the conversation with him. And on the right, then 5 years later, she was buried right next to him. And this quote has been already mentioned before. It's quite moving and also somewhat disturbing that she shares with Heidegger in particular, that the micro world breaks away now for her. And it's also quite moving that her thought journal kind of breaks away. She kept a journal, a thinking journal, and it seems like after 1970, she has only very banal entries where she's staying on a trip, and that was after Heinrich's death, as if her inner community, her inner dialogue somewhat breaks away or changes after her partner in dialogue is no longer there. And one last item I'd like to share with you. There's a brand new medallion at 370 Riverside Drive, Manhattan. And look at this, I mean, it saddens me. Look at this brand new, beautiful plaque for Hannah Arendt, where we don't find Heinrich Blücher. There will be a celebration tomorrow for Hannah Arendt for her birthday. But Heinrich Blücher lived there. They shared a life in that apartment. At least I could remind you. Thank you for your attention. Oops.
That's a good point about Heinrich.
Yeah, I have actually at Bard College Berlin been advocating for renaming it to Heinrich Blücher College with not much success. So thank you so much, Roger, for inviting me and including me in this conference, and thank you for everyone else who made possible this wonderful conference. It's an honor for me to be here. So while I speak, you can look at this picture. I found it in Helen Wolff's papers. It's been taken probably in the beginning of the 1970s, somewhere at a fancy place in New York. And you see Hannah Arendt at the left side, or cut in half, and Helen Wolff in the center back. Two elderly ladies, Hannah more flamboyant, Helen more inconspicuous, in a group of merry male writers and literary critics, middle-aged white men, all of them. The only one that I can recognize in this group is W.H. Auden, and if anyone here in the audience could help me out identifying some of the other guys, I'd be very grateful, and also where this photo has been taken. So the two ladies in there, Hannah and Helen, are friends, by that time good friends. Auden was also, to a certain degree, a friend to both of them. And there are probably other friendships going on. But the picture maybe illustrates the point that I want to make today, that there's not just friendship, there's always also society. And the society supports friendship, but also burdens it and loadens it. And it's always a specific, historically situated society that sets the conditions not for thinking, not for Hannah Arendt's thoughts, so thoughts always go their own ways, but for how her thoughts and her judgments were able to enter the world materially, and at the time in form of books and of articles. So it's about publishing in the broadest sense. And indeed, what was said before, that these correspondences of these people, that they have been published, it's by no sense self-understood. But let me start with another woman who's not in this picture, and she would probably not have been invited to this illustrious round, Lotte Köhler. Lotte Köhler, as most of you know, was one of the closest friends of Hannah Arendt, and together with Mary McCarthy, executor of her will. And she had responsibility to decide what of Hannah Arendt's private correspondences would be published and when and how. And she also influenced, to a certain degree, our image of the micro-worlds and micro-world that Hannah Arendt fostered in interviews she gave and in the introductions to correspondences that she wrote. And there's one image of that micro-world that is famous as a tribe, a family, a close-knit circle with Hannah Arendt at the center, and then other friends who were outside, and then the tribe, and then other friends who were outside of the tribe, or sometimes only momentarily part of it or for a time. Among the friends that Lotte Köhler explicitly considered not part of the tribe was the publisher Helen Wolff. Lotte Köhler coined for the relationship between Helen Wolff and Hannah Arendt the term respectful distance. And that term was taken up later by Ursula Lutz when she edited their correspondence. So who was Helen Wolff? She had a reputation on both sides of the Atlantic as a publisher of mainly European translated books in the US. She was born the same year as Arendt, in 1906, in a German-Austrian family on the Balkans. In the years before the Nazi takeover, she was a secretary, a translator, the lover, and then the second wife of Kurt Wolff. For 4 years, she also had been a babysitter, but that was kept secret later. And Kurt Wolff had been a famous publisher in the 1910s and 1920s. Together, they left Nazi Germany in 1933 and went to France, like Hannah Arendt. But very much unlike Hannah Arendt, they were not Jewish, and their experience of exile was a fundamentally different one. The recently published biography of Hannah Arendt by Thomas Meyer tells that story very beautifully. So in Europe, the Wolffs and Arendt therefore never met. They only met after they all arrived in New York in spring 1941. And in New York, the Wolffs founded the publishing house Pantheon Books as a shoestring operation that soon became a fine address for European literature. In 1960, they resigned from Pantheon and then joined a much larger publishing house, Harcourt Brace, where they got their own imprint, a Helen and Kurt Wolff book under Harcourt's dynamic and powerful president, Bill Jovanovic. Arendt, in the 1940s, had worked as an editor for Salman Schocken, and she wrote literary reviews. Almost all of them were on Pantheon Books. Now, the Wolffs and Arendt were connected through an entire network of relations. And by 1948, they referred to each other as friends. In the 1950s, they collaborated on publishing projects, publishing books of authors. So Hannah Arendt didn't only write, she wasn't only an author, she also was an editor on books that she cared deeply for, by Benjamin, Jaspers, and Heidegger. When Kurt Wolff died in 1963, Helen continued on her own in partnership with Bill Jovanovic, and Arendt changed her publisher, so she left Denver Lindley at Viking and went to Harcourt Brace. Helen and Hannah were friends. They saw each other often and wrote each other many letters. Still, in their published letters, there's this respectful distance. And only in 1972, 1973, they changed from the more formal Sie to the intimate Du. There are several reasons for the distance. One very interesting reason was her, Helen's ambiguous position as a non-Jewish and non-political immigrant. And it seems that only around 1970, Helen was able to clear up misunderstandings or uncertainties that Hannah might have had about her until then. What connected them on a personal level especially was that they recognized themselves in each other's devoted love for their often unfaithful husbands. Hannah wrote in a letter to Jaspers after Kurt Wolff's death, "I like her a lot. It is difficult for her to go on living. She loved the man very much and without any illusions. I have given her high credit. I have always given her high credit for that." So that's a very fundamental thing. Yeah? Love without illusion in a clearly gendered dedication to a common world that they both deeply and in a motherly way cared for. So, but I want now to focus on something else, on how this distance between them was co-determined by their acting at the interface between the private and the public in this publishing, by bringing into the world the ideas and language that they cared for. And so we have to look at the constraints and the conditions and the constellations of their publishing at specific historical moments. And this now is connected to a methodological problem, because these constraints and conditions were of a kind that also shaped the primary sources. They affected the materials on which we now today base our narrations and interpretations. When Elizabeth Young Brühl published her the first biography on Hannah Arendt in 1982, only 6 years after Hannah Arendt's death, it only mentioned Helen Wolff in half a sentence as the wife of Kurt Wolff, although she did say that they were part of the tribe. Lotte Köhler in that biography was also just mentioned briefly, and another friend of all three of them, of Lotte, Hannah, and Helen, was not mentioned at all, the young German writer Uwe Johnson. Johnson wrote a letter to Lotte Köhler that I found in Helen's papers that made a connection between an apparently self-chosen invisibility due to the discretion of Helen and Lotte, and historical truth. So, and discretion is really the key word here. Can we go to the quote in the, yeah, I translated it into English and I don't have the German original, even though it would be much nicer. One can overdo it with the understatement, I think, because Hannah will not have marked many people like you, you being Lotte Köhler, Sonder, Fehl noch Tadel, which is an old-fashioned expression, without fault, without blemish. Such trust, I feel, is worth mentioning, both because of the person who gave it and the one to whom it applied. The same goes for Helen. Between Hannah and Helen, there was an interchange of words, a kind unique in this century, such as will never occur again in the next. Discretion is nice, as good manners have it, only through the fault of this virtue, something is missing in this history of persons. Something is missing. So what is discretion? It's the art of making a specific distinction, a judgment, what is for the public eye and what should be kept private. Discretion is necessary for trusting each other, especially on vulnerable positions. But how the line between the spheres of the private and the public is being drawn is historically contingent, and the constraints and conditions change. So it's not modesty, but judgment, good judgment, that made Lotte and Helen want to stay in the background. And that judgment also affected which letters of their own correspondences became accessible to the public and which didn't. And interestingly, several letters of Helen Wolff to Hannah Arendt cannot be found in the Hannah Arendt papers. They are in Helen Wolff's papers. The 1970s, when this gathering took place, can you go to the picture again, back? Yeah, thank you. So these 1970s were not an easy time, both for Helen and for Hannah. Helen could share the difficulties that she had in the 1970s at Harcourt Brace as an elderly immigrant woman past the retirement age with only very, very few people. A lot of her experiences, convictions, and beliefs seemed at the time outdated. Hannah Arendt was the same age, also a widow, and she shared some of Helen's seemingly outdated experiences and convictions. And she knew the publishing world firsthand, not only as an author, but also as an editor, and as someone deeply invested in the fate of books. The publishing environment in the 1970s was shaped by two developments, very briefly, the commercialization of the book market and the so-called women's lib, the second wave of feminism that at Harcourt Brace had very paradox effects. Helen and Hannah together in the mid-1970s felt too old to take onto themselves a new edition of Heidegger's works that Hannah Arendt had wished for. But that they felt old doesn't mean that they didn't trust their own and each other's judgment. Hannah Arendt was, before she died, able to mediate between Bill Jovanovic and Helen Wolff. And it's to a large part thanks to Hannah Arendt that Helen Wolff was able to survive the 1970s at Harcourt Brace as a publisher and to continue her imprint for another 20 very successful years until she died in 1994. So you see, they could rely on each other, and what they told each other and wrote to each other, of course, had to be kept strictly confidential. And we can only understand the quality of their friendship through historicization and critical examination of the primary sources. Thank you.
Thank you all three very much. It's really beautiful to bring the conference to a close on these reflections on Arendt and her friendship, which has sort of inspired the whole conference. I have some questions, but we don't have a lot of time. But if there are some questions in the audience, I'd also prioritize those over mine if people have them.
Oh, hello. Thank you very much. I just, something I've always wondered about and partly came to this conference to find out is that I happen to know Lotte Koehler since about the year 2000 until her death. And she was such an interesting woman. And she was intensely interested herself in many things, including psychoanalysis. And when I asked her what was Hannah Arendt's relationship to the inner world, because the Upper West Side was just a veritable, teeming with every kind of therapy and exploration. And then I wondered about Hannah Arendt's relationship to the Michelish work, the Unfähigkeit zu trauen, the whole Nachtkrieg. Well, is there anything that you could speak to about that aspect of Hannah's thought?
Well, as far as I know, that she was deeply suspicious of psychoanalysis. She didn't like it at all. And she was also very suspicious of German memory culture. And I think she was right. So this guilt thing of the Germans that prevented them from taking responsibility. There's a very, very nice letter by Blücher to Arendt, if I remember correctly, where he rages about that. I don't know of any of any quote or so where she comments Mitscherlich's work, but she wanted responsibility. Yeah, she wanted political judgment. She didn't want the Germans centering around their own guilt and reconstructing their Volksgemeinschaft in this common guilt.
I'm so glad that Barbara.Von Bechtolsheim brought up Hannah Arendt's notion of natality. The ability of something new to enter the world. And I wonder whether it's related to her, if any of you think this was related to her notion of eternity and Jasper's notion of immortality. And I was struck recently reading Jasper's The Atomic Bomb and the Future of Mankind, in which he talks and ends the final chapter, Fear and Confidence, with this notion of the seriousness of immortality. I saw a lot of influence, obviously, on Hannah Arendt's thinking on eternity, on thinking and action. But I was struck with his words, let us not slander its beauty. And these notions seem perhaps connected. I'm interested in hearing whether you think they're connected. Natality or nativity, immortality, eternity, and love. And it seems to me an interesting way to think about friendship in a kind of different way. I'm also thinking here of Giorgio Agamben's gorgeous essay, The Friend, in a little tiny book of 3 essays, What is the Contemporary, in which he tries to talk about the friend in terms of sensing and thinking together, which constitutes the very notion of consent.
Great, thank you. Do any of you want to talk about natality, love, and immortality? No? Yeah, I mean, Arendt also, of course, wrote quite a bit on immortality. And for her, immortality is different from eternity. It's a worldly immortality, and it's the remembrance of things that deserve to be remembered. And so there is a kind of need for action and newness in order to make things that are going to be remembered. But yes, I mean, one of the interesting things about Arendt and her friends is, I mean, when you run the Hannah Arendt Center, you get emails every week from people said, I've just written the new thing that proves that Hannah Arendt was a Machiavellian. Or Hannah Arendt was a Jaspers. Yeah, everything came from Jaspers. Everything came from Heidegger. Everything came from Kant. And people are always trying to prove these things. And one of the things that's unique about Hannah Arendt is she was unique, and it's rare to be unique. She was someone who thought for herself and took from lots of people, but really was unique in the world, and that's a wonderful thing. I think I'll end with one. Okay, go ahead.
One brief remark as to natality. For her, that was not thinking about the human life or humanity in terms of against mortality. It was like turning things around. And I mean, her notion definitely has to do with leaving everything behind. Western tradition had broken down, her home country, everything. And to think of an individual human being in the world to be something new, to be someone new, and to create something unique. that to her was, in my opinion, the very different from previous philosophical discussions.
Thank you. So maybe just one last question that I'll let all three of you comment on briefly because we're out of time. But we've been talking about Hannah Arendt and her friendships, and Alex rightly talked about it as a micro world. And a lot of what she writes about friendship, she says at one point, friendship is between two people. But especially at the panel this morning with Marissa and Esther, and there was this idea of a group. And you guys talked about a community and a tribe. And tribe is it's funny, I don't think tribe came up before to this panel. And the idea that Hannah Arendt was sort of the leader of this tribe is actually a very part of, and it hasn't been talked about. So I guess I'd like to have you just each think a little bit about the relationship between friendship and tribe. And briefly, if you can, and say like, what's their relation and how did what was the relationship between tribe? What's the place of a tribe in Hannah Arendt's idea of friendship?
Is this on? Yes. Yeah, I would probably have to think about it a little bit more, but it does seem to get closer to a community, and it does seem to get. She does usually talk about friendship as if it's just between two people, as you say. It gets a little bit more complicated when you add quite a few people to that, and we did see that she held together a large group of people and kept them coming back time after time and entertained them and had New Year's Eve parties and all of these sorts of things. So she was very good at holding people together like that. But it starts to constitute something a bit closer to a community, perhaps. And I would say, while both there can be a lot of joy in being in a group like that, at the same time, it too, the more people that are in a group, I suppose, the more likely it is that some kind of trespassing on the friend could occur. Yeah, and I think it's actually interesting to think about the tribe as well as also constituting lots of other little friendships. So there would have been people within that group who had closer friendships with some in the group than with others. So I think it just becomes quite complex. And yeah.
Yeah, I wonder whether Hannah Arendt herself ever used that term. Did she? So
I think she did. Yeah,
yeah?
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So I think at least the way that Lotte Köhler used it when I interviewed her in 2011, it also had some notions of like the negative feelings that Jana mentioned, envy or disappointment, or that she maybe was not as close to Hannah Arendt anymore in the last years, or maybe not, I don't know, yeah, but it wasn't only positive. And then the second very interesting thing is that tribe, so she didn't really have a family, or she had relatives in Israel, but she didn't have a family in the sense that Helen Wolff had a family. Helen Wolff had a large family that across the Atlantic and across the abyss of what happened between 1933 and 45 hold together. Hannah Arendt didn't have that, but then they used this family term tribe, and also they called it family, and not to compensate, but to maybe ironically refer to it. Yeah, but what to make out of it, I don't know.
To me, this term, tribe or family, implies that they created a space. I think this concept of space was important for both of them, Blücher, Arendt. create a space for exploration. And also I would say that the tribe, family, whatever we want to call it, was selective. Either you belonged or you didn't belong. And the common denominator was intellectuals who didn't stop thinking and asking questions.
I would also just add that it was a very unique time for them. So not all, but many of the members of the tribe were people who'd been displaced, and so this was a real home for them, which might have been what kept them coming back.
And she also was friends with her cleaning lady. Yeah. I don't remember her name, but she had a personal, strong, emotional relationship to her. And when she was sick, she would ask Lotte to also forward news to that lady. Yeah.
Well, thank you three very much. Alex, Marianne, and Barbara, thank you very much. Thank you. So we're going to have a reception. Before we do, we have some people joined the raffle for this. I actually love this piece of art. I'll just read it because it's three quotes from Hannah Arendt, but I think they're quotes that we all enjoy hearing. The first on the red is: the most striking difference between ancient and modern sophists is that the ancients were satisfied with a passing victory of their argument at the expense of truth, whereas the moderns want a more lasting victory at the expense of reality. And then here in the gold, I think, racism may indeed carry out the doom of Western world, and for that matter, of the whole of civilization. And then in the green, before mass leaders seize the power to fit reality to their lies, their propaganda is marked by its extreme contempt for facts as such, for in their opinion, fact depends entirely on the power of a man who can fabricate it. And by Julia Cesko. So, you want to pick? Why don't you pick? You pick.
Really?
Yeah. Here's the winner of this piece of art. Who is it? Oh, one of my students, Mia Tanizaki. Is she here? Is Mia here? No? Did she leave? Okay, well, Mia gets it, so congratulations to Mia. That's great. So just so you know, there's a couple ways, those of you who are new to the center, there's a couple ways to continue the conversation. The virtual reading group meets every Friday, usually, at 1 o'clock, and we'd love you to join us. There's also a new podcast, Reading Hannah Arendt, and we'd love you to subscribe to that and listen. And then there's dialogue groups where you can talk about Hannah Arendt in smaller groups. All of that is available on our website, and we look forward to seeing you there. The shuttle leaves to go to Hessel at 4:30, which is past now, so it'll leave very soon. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next year.